Haunted by his wife's death, Sergeant Ethan Parker returns from service to raise his daughter Sophie alone until he notices bruises, fear, and chilling clues that Julia might still be alive. His search uncovers a shocking betrayal. Julia faked her death and had been abusing Sophie with the help of his best friend. As the truth explodes in court, Ethan fights for justice and begins to rebuild a life where Sophie's healing and resilience take center stage. Chaplain Morrison stood there, water dripping from his cap, holding an envelope that might as well have been a death certificate. "I'm sorry, Sergeant," he said, and those words hung in the air like smoke from a burning village. "It's about Julia. There's been an accident." Now, funny thing about death notices, they never give you the whole truth. Just enough to break you down proper. "Car accident," they said. Icy roads near Millfield Bridge. Vehicle went straight through the guardrail and into the river below. They found the car, found her purse, found one single red high-heel shoe caught in the brambles. But Julia? Well, the river had claimed her, or so they said. Ethan Parker had survived 2 tours in Afghanistan, had pulled 3 men from a burning Humvee, had stared down death more times than most men count birthdays. But sitting in that barracks, holding that telegram, he crumbled like old paper. Because losing your brothers in arms is one thing. Losing the woman who promised to wait for you, that's a wound that bleeds inward, where nobody can stitch it shut. They gave him emergency leave, sent him home on the next transport. 14 hours of flying over an ocean that suddenly seemed as wide as his grief. 14 hours to imagine walking into an empty house, to picture his daughter Sophie's face when he had to tell her that mommy wasn't coming home. But here's the thing about war, it teaches you to notice things. The way shadows fall wrong. The way silence sounds different when it's hiding something. And when Ethan Parker walked into his house in Millfield, Pennsylvania, that silence was screaming. The house still smelled like Julia. Chanel No. 5 mixed with something sharper, something that reminded him of the medical tents overseas. Cleaning supplies, maybe, or fear. Fear has its own smell, you know. Sweet and sour at the same time, like fruit left too long in the sun. Sophie was staying with the neighbors, the Hendersons. Good people, the kind who brought casseroles when times got hard and never asked for anything in return. But when Ethan went to collect his daughter, he found her sitting in their kitchen, staring at a bowl of peach slices like they might bite. Her back. "Sophie, sweetheart," he said, kneeling down to her level. She looked up with those gray eyes that mirrored his own, but there was something in them that hadn't been there before. Something that made his chest tight. "Daddy," she whispered. And then she was in his arms, small and trembling like a bird. Mommy went away. Mrs. Henderson watched from the doorway, wringing her hands. "She hasn't eaten much," she said quietly. "Won't touch anything yellow or orange. And she's been having nightmares." That first night back in his own house, Ethan learned what his daughter's nightmares sounded like. Like a small animal caught in a trap. Like someone trying to scream through a pillow. He found her thrashing in her little bed, clawing at her own arms, whimpering words that made his blood run cold. "Mommy said quiet. Mommy said be good. Mommy said too loud." He held her until the shaking stopped, until her breathing evened out. But even in sleep, she flinched when he touched her. Like she'd learned to expect pain instead of comfort. And there on her thigh, barely visible in the moonlight filtering through her princess curtains, was a scar shaped like a small circle. Like someone had pressed something hot against her skin and held it there. Ethan Parker had seen cigarette burns before. In villages where the wrong people had too much power. On prisoners who'd been asked the wrong questions. But never on his own daughter's skin. The next morning, Sophie wouldn't enter the master bedroom. Wouldn't even look through the doorway. When he asked her why, she just shook her head and said, "Mommy gets mad in there." Gets, not got, gets. Present tense. Like Julia was still alive somewhere in that room, still capable of anger, he found other things too. Small things that might mean nothing to anyone else but felt like landmines to a man trained to spot danger. Sophie's dollhouse was arranged with military precision, every piece of furniture in exact positions. When he moved a tiny chair just an inch, Sophie flew into a panic that took 20 minutes to calm. "Has to be right," she gasped through her tears. "Mommy says has to be right, or she gets mad." There was a lock on the toy box that hadn't been there before he deployed. Heavy duty, the kind you'd put on a gun safe. Sophie said she didn't have the key, said Mommy had taken it away because she'd been bad. And then there were the pills. Ethan found them in Julia's knitstand drawer, prescription bottles with Sophie's name on them. Anxiety medication for a 5-year-old. Sleep aids. Something called risperidone that he had to look up online. Antipsychotic medication. For his daughter who'd been perfectly normal when he left. The prescribing doctor was someone he'd never heard of. Dr. Elizabeth Crenshaw, pediatric psychiatrist. When he called her office, the receptionist told him that Mrs. Parker had been very concerned about Sophie's behavioral issues and had insisted on the strongest possible intervention. "What behavioral issues?" Ethan asked. "I'm sorry, sir, but I can't discuss specific medical details over the phone. You'll need to make an appointment." The appointment was scheduled for 3 days out. 3 days of watching his daughter flinch at unexpected sounds. 3 days of her refusing to eat anything that wasn't white or brown. 3 days of wondering what the hell had happened in his house while he was overseas. It was Dr. Maria Ruiz who gave him the first real answers. Sophie's school counselor was a small woman, with kind eyes and the kind of patience that comes from years of working with broken children. She asked to meet with Ethan alone first, in her office that smelled like crayons and hope. "Your daughter is exhibiting signs of severe trauma," she said without preamble. "The kind of fear that learns to be quiet, if you understand what I mean." Ethan understood. He'd seen it in the villages, children who'd learned that making noise brought attention they didn't want. "What kind of trauma?" he asked. Dr. Ruiz opened a file folder and showed him drawings. Sophie's artwork from the past 6 months, while he'd been deployed. They started normal enough, stick figures of a family, a house with a big yellow sun, flowers in a garden. But as the months progressed, the drawings changed. The stick figure mother grew larger, more dominant. The father figure disappeared entirely, and the little girl in the pictures got smaller and smaller until she was barely visible, hidden behind furniture or pressed into corners. "She drew these during our sessions," Dr. Ruiz explained. "I've been seeing Sophie since January, when her teacher noticed some concerning behaviors." "What kind of behaviors?" "Hoarding food, excessive compliance. She would ask permission to use the bathroom, to drink water, to speak. And she had what we call hypervigilance, constantly scanning the environment for threats." The last drawing in the file made Ethan's hands shake. It showed a house, but this time there were 2 stick figures in it. A large one and a very small one. The large figure had something in its hand, something that looked like a cigarette. And the small figure was on the ground. "I contacted Child Protective Services," Dr. Ruiz said quietly. "But your wife was very convincing. She said Sophie was acting out because she missed you, that the drawings were just her way of expressing confusion about your absence. And they believed her? Your wife was very charming, Mr. Parker, very persuasive. She brought medical documentation about Sophie's supposed behavioral disorders, prescriptions from a respected psychiatrist. She painted a picture of a devoted mother struggling with a traumatized child while her husband was deployed." Ethan stared at the drawings, seeing his daughter's fear frozen in crayon and construction paper. "What do you think really happened?" "I think Sophie was telling us the truth the only way she could, but proving that. With a child who's been conditioned not to speak about what happens at home, that's almost impossible." That night, Ethan sat in his daughter's room watching her sleep, trying to piece together the fragments of a picture he was afraid to see completely. His wife, the woman he'd married 6 years ago, the woman who'd cried when he deployed, who'd written him letters full of love and longing. Had she really done this? Had she really hurt their daughter? He was still sitting there when Sophie's eyes opened in the pre-dawn darkness. "Daddy?" she whispered. "Are you real?" "I'm real, sweetheart. I'm right here. Mommy said you weren't coming back. She said soldiers don't come back when little girls are bad." Ethan felt something break inside his chest. "Baby, you weren't bad. You're never bad. And I did come back. I'll always come back for you." Sophie was quiet for a long moment, studying his face in the dim light. Then she said something that changed everything. "Daddy, I have a secret. You can tell me any secret, Sophie. I promise." She reached under her pillow and pulled out a small digital recorder, the kind they sold at electronics stores. It was pink and covered with princess stickers. "Mommy didn't know about this," she whispered. "I found it in your desk. I've been practicing with it, like you showed me before you went away." Ethan remembered. He'd been teaching her to use the voice recorder on his phone, helping her practice reading stories so she could play them back and hear how she sounded. She'd loved it, had begged for her own recorder. "What did you record, sweetheart?" "Mommy and Uncle Thomas. They thought I was sleeping, but I wasn't. I was scared, so I turned it on, Thomas." Ethan's best friend since basic training, his best man at the wedding. The guy who'd promised to look after Julia and Sophie while he was deployed. Sophie pressed play, and Julia's voice filled the quiet room. But it wasn't the Julia from the letters, wasn't the loving wife and mother. This Julia's voice was cold, calculating. "The insurance money comes through next month," she was saying. 200,000 from the military policy, another 100 from the private one. Thomas's voice answered, and Ethan felt the world tilt on its axis. What about the kid? What about her? She's a problem that solves itself. A few more months of the medication, maybe a little accident. Kids are fragile. Things happen. Ethan's vision went white around the edges. The recording continued. "Besides," Julia continued, "Ethan's not coming back. I made sure of that." "How?" "Let's just say his commanding officer got some very disturbing letters. About PTSD, about threats. He's made. They'll never send him home to a child. Not after what I told them." The recording went on, but Ethan had stopped hearing the words. His daughter, his tiny brave daughter, had been gathering evidence while he'd been half a world away, believing his wife's lies. "Sophie," he said when the recording ended, "how long have you been scared of Mommy?" "Since you went away the first time," she whispered. "She was nice when you were here. But when you left, she got different. And Uncle Thomas came over, and they would talk about bad things. And sometimes Mommy would get angry, and she would." She trailed off, but Ethan could see the small round scar on her thigh in the dim light. The next morning, Ethan called in sick to his mandatory reintegration counseling and drove to the one place he thought might have answers, the police station, where the accident report had been filed. Officer Janet Mills had been the responding officer at Millfield Bridge that night. A 20-year veteran with sharp eyes and a reputation for thoroughness. She remembered the case clearly. "Strange accident," she said, pulling the file from her desk drawer. "The car was traveling at high speed when it went through the guardrail, but there were no skid marks. Like the driver didn't even try to stop. What about the body? Never found one. The river was running high that night, lots of current. But we found her purse, her shoes, even her wedding ring caught on a branch downstream. Everything that would normally stay with a body in the water." Ethan studied the photos from the scene. The car was completely submerged, but something about the positioning bothered him. "Did you dust for prints?" "Standard procedure. Found hers on the steering wheel and door handle. But here's the odd thing, we also found a second set. Male, partial thumbprint on the passenger side door handle. Did you run them? Through the system, yeah. No matches in the criminal database. But if you have a suspect. She looked at him meaningfully. I might, Ethan said. What would you need? Voluntary prints for comparison. And a damn good reason to reopen a closed case. Ethan thought about the recorder in Sophie's room, about his daughter's scarred leg, about Julia's voice talking about making problems disappear. I think I can provide both. That afternoon, while Sophie was at school, Ethan drove to Thomas Green's apartment across town. They'd been friends for 8 years, had saved each other's lives in Kandahar, had stood beside each other at the altar when Ethan married Julia. If there was an innocent explanation, if this was all some horrible misunderstanding, Thomas would help him figure it out. Thomas answered the door looking like he'd seen a ghost, which, Ethan supposed, he had. Jesus, Ethan. We all thought you weren't coming back. Why would you think that? Thomas stepped aside to let him in, but Ethan noticed his hands were shaking. The letters Julia showed us. From your CO, said you were having problems, that you might not be fit for civilian life. What letters? Come on, man. The ones about the anger issues, the threats you made. Julia was terrified you might hurt Sophie when you got back. Ethan felt pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. Thomas, I never wrote any letters like that, and I never made any threats. Thomas's face went pale. But Julia said, she showed us copies. Copies of what? Letters you supposedly sent her. Rambling stuff about how the war had changed you, how you didn't think you could control yourself around Sophie anymore. Really disturbing shit, man. Ethan pulled out his phone and showed Thomas the call log. I called Julia exactly 12 times in 6 months. Every call was monitored by base communications. There are records. Thomas sat heavily on his couch, head in his hands. Oh God, Ethan, what did she do? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Starting with what happened the night Julia supposedly died. Thomas was quiet for a long time. Then slowly he started talking about how Julia had called him that night, frantic and scared. About how she'd said she was leaving Ethan, that she couldn't take it anymore, couldn't wait for him to come home and potentially hurt Sophie. About how she'd asked him to help her disappear, to start over somewhere safe. She said she had evidence that you were dangerous, Thomas continued. Recordings of phone calls where you'd threatened her. Medical records showing Sophie's injuries that she said you'd caused before you deployed. And you believed her? Man, you weren't here. You didn't see Sophie after you left. That kid was terrified of everything. She wouldn't talk, wouldn't eat, had bruises she couldn't explain. Julia said you'd done things to her before you left. Things that were so bad Sophie had blocked them out. Ethan felt sick, so you helped her fake her death? I drove her to the bridge that night. She said it was the only way to keep Sophie safe until the military decided you weren't fit to come home. The plan was to lie low for a few months, let the system work, then come forward and file for full custody when you were declared mentally unfit. Where is she, Thomas? Thomas met his eyes, and Ethan saw genuine remorse there. I don't know, man. I swear to God, I don't know. After that night, she just vanished. I thought maybe she'd decided to stay hidden permanently, start completely over. But you've been in contact with her. It wasn't a question, and Thomas didn't try to deny it. She calls sometimes. Always from different numbers, never says where she is. Just checks in, asks about Sophie, asks if you've come home yet. When was the last time? 3 days ago. Right after the news hit that you were being discharged. Ethan leaned forward. What did she say? That the plan had worked too well. That keeping Sophie away from you was supposed to be temporary, but now she was trapped. If she came forward, she'd be charged with insurance fraud, child endangerment, filing false reports. Her only option was to stay dead. What about Sophie? She said Sophie was better off without both of you. That the kid was damaged goods anyway. That she'd probably end up in foster care regardless. The casual cruelty of it hit Ethan like a physical blow. His wife, talking about their daughter like she was a broken appliance to be discarded. "There's something else," Thomas said quietly. "Something I should have told the police but didn't because I thought I was protecting Sophie." "What?" "Julia's pregnant. About 4 months along." The room seemed to spin around Ethan. Whose baby? Thomas couldn't meet his eyes. "Mine." Everything clicked into place then. The insurance money, the faked death, the systematic destruction of Sophie's mental health to make her an unreliable witness. Julia hadn't just been running from an unwanted marriage. She'd been clearing the decks for a new life with a new man and a new baby. And Sophie had been collateral damage. "Where can I find her, Thomas?" "I told you I don't know." Evan stood up and Thomas flinched backward. "Let me rephrase that. Where can I find her before I go to the police with everything I know?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. Then he walked to a desk in the corner and pulled out a cell phone. "This is the number she calls from. It's always the same one for a few weeks, then she changes it. But maybe ... nay." He dialed, put it on speaker. It rang 4 times, then went to voicemail. Julia's voice, bright and cheerful. "Hi, you've reached Sarah Mitchell. Leave a message and I'll get back to you." Sarah Mitchell. Ethan memorized the name. "There's a P.O. box too," Thomas continued. "In Millfield. Box 447. She had me rent it before she disappeared. Said she might need it for forwarding mail or whatever." Box 447. Ethan wrote it down. "Thomas," he said as he headed for the door, "if you really want to help Sophie, you'll come with me to the police station tomorrow morning. You'll tell them everything, and you'll give them your fingerprints." "Ethan, I can't. If Julia finds out I talked to you, ... Julia's not your problem anymore. She never was. Your problem is a 5-year-old girl who's been living in hell while the adults in her life played games with her safety." That night, Ethan sat Sophie down for the hardest conversation of his life. He explained, in terms a child could understand, that Mommy hadn't really died. That Mommy had been playing a game of pretend, but that the game had hurt people, and now it had to stop. Sophie listened with the gravity of a much older child, nodding when he paused to make sure she understood. When he finished, she was quiet. For a long time. "Is Mommy going to come back?" she finally asked. "I don't know, sweetheart. But if she does, she's going to have to answer for what she did to you, to us. Will I have to see her?" "Not if you don't want to. Not until you're ready, if you're ever ready." Sophie thought about this. "Can I keep my recorder?" "You can keep your recorder. And can we get the locks changed? So Mommy can't get in even if she has keys?" Ethan felt his heart break a little more. "We can get the locks changed." The next morning, Thomas kept his word. He met Ethan at the police station and told Officer Mills everything. They took his fingerprints, and within an hour, they had a match to the prints on Julia's car door. The case was officially reopened. Meanwhile, Ethan drove to the post office to check box 447. The clerk was helpful. Sarah Mitchell had indeed rented the box, and there was mail waiting. A stack of forwarded bills, some junk mail, and one item that made Ethan's blood run cold. A bank statement from First National of Belize. The statement showed a balance of $287,000, deposits that corresponded exactly with the dates of Julia's supposed insurance payouts. He also found the lease agreement. Sarah Mitchell had rented a house at 1247 Sycamore Street, right here in Millfield. Less than 2 miles from their old house. Julia hadn't disappeared to some far-off country. She'd been hiding in plain sight, probably watching, waiting to see what would happen when Ethan came home. Ethan called Officer Mills, gave her the address, and asked her to meet him there. But when they pulled up to 1247 Sycamore Street, The house was dark and looked abandoned. Landlord, a grumpy man named Peterson, let them inside with his master key. The house was furnished but felt unlived in, like a movie set waiting for actors. Except for one room, the nursery. It was painted soft yellow, filled with new furniture, expensive toys, everything a baby could need. And on the changing table, Ethan found something that made his hands shake. A birth certificate application, partially filled out. Baby girl Mitchell. Father, Thomas Allen Green. Mother, Sarah Julia Mitchell. She's planning to come back, Officer Mills said quietly. After the baby's born, she probably figures enough time will have passed that she can resurface as Sarah Mitchell. New identity, new life. What about Sophie? Sophie's the loose end, the only person who really knows what happened. They searched the rest of the house and found more evidence of Julia's long-term planning. Medical records for Sarah Mitchell, a driver's license application, even school enrollment forms for a child named Emma Mitchell, Sophie's middle name. Julia had been planning to take Sophie after all. Not out of love, but because a grieving widow with a traumatized daughter made a more sympathetic figure than a single mother with a suspicious past. That evening, Ethan was giving Sophie her bath when she looked up at him with those serious gray eyes. Daddy, I saw Mommy today. Ethan's hands stilled on the washcloth. Where did you see her, sweetheart? At the grocery store. She was in the baby stuff section, and she had a big belly like Mrs. Henderson did before her baby came. Are you sure it was Mommy? She had different hair. Yellow hair instead of brown. But it was her eyes and her hands. Mommy has a scar on her thumb from when she cut it opening a can. I saw the scar. Ethan helped Sophie out of the tub and wrapped her in a big fluffy towel. What did you do when you saw her? I hid behind the cereal boxes. But I think she saw me too, because she left really fast. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Ethan called Officer Mills. She's still in town, he reported. Sophie saw her at Brennan's Market this afternoon. We've got units patrolling the area, Mills said. And we've put out a bolo for Sarah Mitchell. But Ethan, you need to be careful. If she's desperate enough to fake her own death, there's no telling what she might do when she realizes we're closing in. Ethan checked the locks on all the doors and windows, set up a chair by Sophie's bedroom door, and settled in to wait. He'd learned patience in the military, learned to watch and wait and be ready for anything. But this was different. This was personal. At 2:17 a.m., he heard it. The soft scrape of metal on metal, someone working on the back door lock. Ethan eased out of his chair, grabbed the baseball bat he'd placed within reach, and crept down the hallway. Through the kitchen window, he could see a figure hunched over the door. Blonde hair, maternity clothes, familiar hands working with tools that shouldn't have been familiar to his wife. Julia had learned new skills during her time as Sarah Mitchell. Ethan waited until she got the door open, waited until she stepped inside, and then he turned on the lights. Julia Parker, or Sarah Mitchell, stood frozen in his kitchen doorway, 7 months pregnant and holding a set of lockpicks. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She looked older, harder around the edges. The soft domesticity she'd worn during their marriage had been replaced by something sharper, more calculating. This was a woman who'd learned to lie professionally. Hello, Ethan, she said finally. You look good. Can't say the same about you, Julia. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I go by Sarah now. Julia Parker died 6 months ago, remember? I remember. I also remember that she left behind a traumatized daughter and a husband who thought he was a widower. Yes, well, sacrifices had to be made. The casual way she said it made Ethan's jaw clench. Sacrifices. Is that what you call burning our daughter with cigarettes? Julia's hand moved instinctively to her belly, protective. Sophie was a difficult child. She needed discipline. She needed her mother to love her, not torture her. Love, Julia laughed. A sound like breaking glass. Do you know what love got me, Ethan? Stuck in a house with a screaming child while you played soldier on the other side of the world. Do you know what it's like to be alone with a kid who never stops crying, never stops asking for daddy, never stops being needy and clingy and exhausting? It's called being a parent. It's called being a prisoner. And I decided I was done serving that sentence. Ethan heard a small sound from the hallway and saw Sophie peeking around the corner, her stuffed rabbit clutched in her arms. Julia saw her too, and her expression softened into something that might have been maternal if you didn't know better. "Hello, baby girl," Julia said sweetly. "Mommy missed you so much." Sophie pressed herself against the wall, shaking her head. "You're not my mommy. Mommy's dead." "Oh, sweetheart, Mommy just had to go away for a while. But I'm back now, and everything's going to be okay." "No." Sophie's voice was small but firm. "You hurt me. You made me scared." Julia's mask slipped for just a moment, showing the cold calculation underneath. "Sophie, you're confused. You've been having bad dreams, remember? The doctor said you might not remember things correctly." "I remember everything," Sophie said, and she held up her pink recorder. "And I have proof." Julia's eyes narrowed as she looked at the device. "What's that, baby?" "It's all the times you were mean to me. All the times you hurt me and said bad things about Daddy. Do you want to hear?" Without waiting for an answer, Sophie pressed play. Julia's voice filled the kitchen, cold and calculating. "The kid's a problem that solves itself. A few more months of the medication, maybe a little accident." The blood drained from Julia's face. "Sophie, where did you get this?" "I made it. Daddy taught me how before he went away. I knew you were bad, so I recorded you being bad, so Daddy would believe me when he came home." Julia looked between Ethan and Sophie, and he could see her recalculating, trying to figure out how much they knew and how much trouble she was in. "You don't understand," she said finally. "I never meant for it to go this far. It was supposed to be temporary. Just until Ethan came home and we could work things out like adults." "Work what out?" Ethan asked. "The part where you convinced my commanding officers that I was dangerous? The part where you drugged our daughter and burned her with cigarettes? Or the part where you stole $300,000 in insurance money? I was protecting her." Julia's voice rose, and Sophie flinched backward. "I was protecting both of us from what you'd become over there. Do you think I didn't read the reports? The things you did, the people you killed. I was a soldier doing my job. You were a killer, and killers don't just turn it off when they come home. Look at the statistics, Ethan. How many military wives end up beaten or dead by their own husbands? So you decided to beat the odds by destroying our daughter's childhood? I decided to take control of a bad situation. Julia's hand moved to her belly again, and I'm still in control." She pulled something from her jacket pocket, a small revolver that looked almost toy-like in her hands. Almost. "Here's what's going to happen," she said conversationally. "Sophie's coming with me. We're going to disappear again, but this time, we're going to do it right. New identities, new life, somewhere you'll never find us." "Julia, put the gun down." "Sarah, my name is Sarah Mitchell, and I'm taking my daughter somewhere safe." Sophie stepped out from behind the wall, still clutching her rabbit. "I don't want to go with you. I want to stay with Daddy." "Sweetheart, you don't have a choice." Julia's voice was gentle, but the gun remained steady. "Daddy's sick. He might hurt you like he hurt people in the war." "Daddy never hurt me," Sophie said with absolute certainty. "Only you hurt me." Julia's mask cracked completely then, showing the desperate woman underneath. "Get your coat, Sophie. We're leaving. Now." But Sophie didn't move. Instead, she looked at her father with complete trust. "Daddy, make her go away." Everything happened very quickly after that. Julia raised the gun, pointing it toward Sophie, and Ethan moved without thinking. He lunged forward, knocking the weapon aside just as it discharged. The bullet shattered a window, and Julia stumbled backward, off balance from her pregnancy. Ethan wrestled the gun away from her and pinned her against the kitchen counter while Sophie ran to call 911, just like he'd taught her. By the time the police arrived, Julia was sitting calmly at the kitchen table, hands folded over her belly, looking like any other expectant mother except for the handcuffs around her wrists. "I want to make a deal," she said as Officer Mills read her rights. "I have information about other cases, other military families. This wasn't my first time." Ethan felt sick. "What do you mean?" Julia smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression he'd ever seen. "Did you really think you were special, Ethan? Did you think you were the only lonely soldier with a fat life insurance policy and a wife who got tired of waiting?" Officer Mills stopped reading and looked up sharply. "How many others?" "4 that worked, 2 that didn't." Julia's voice was matter-of-fact, like she was discussing the weather. "It's easier than you'd think. Military wives have such sad stories. Husbands deployed, children traumatized by daddy's war experiences, tragic accidents that leave widows and orphans in need of community support." "Jesus Christ," Mills breathed. "How long have you been doing this?" "Since before I met Ethan. Thomas wasn't my first partner, just my most recent. Men are so easy to manipulate when you give them what they want and make them feel like heroes. For helping you." The room felt like it was spinning around Ethan. "Who were the others? Does it matter?" "They're dead. Their children are in foster care or with relatives. Their life insurance paid out cleanly. Everyone moved on." Sophie tugged on Ethan's shirt. "Daddy, is the bad lady going to jail?" Ethan picked up his daughter and held her close. "Yes, sweetheart. The bad lady's going to jail for a very long time." Julia looked at them with something that might have been regret if it hadn't been mixed with so much calculation. "Sophie, I want you to know that I did love you, in my way." Sophie studied her for a long moment with those serious gray eyes. Then she said, "Love doesn't hurt people on purpose." And that, Ethan thought, was the wisest thing anyone had said all night. The trial was a media circus. Julia Parker, who had also gone by Sarah Mitchell, Jennifer Wade, and Lisa Thompson in various schemes across 3 states, became the face of a new kind of crime. The prosecution painted her as a black widow who targeted military families, using the system's own sympathy for war widows and traumatized children against itself. The defense tried to argue that she was a victim too, driven to desperate measures by post-traumatic stress and the impossible pressures of military life. But Sophie's testimony, delivered in a quiet voice that somehow carried to every corner of the courtroom, destroyed any sympathy the jury might have had. "She told me Daddy was never coming home," Sophie said, holding her stuffed rabbit tight. "She said soldiers who go away don't love their little girls anymore. But that wasn't true. Daddy came back, just like he promised." The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Catherine Walsh, guided Sophie through her story with gentle questions. Yes, Sophie remembered the cigarette burns. Yes, she remembered being given medicine that made her sleepy and confused. Yes, she remembered her mother and Uncle Thomas talking about making her daddy look bad so he couldn't come home. "And what did you do when you heard these conversations?" Walsh asked. Sophie held up her pink recorder. "I saved them so someone would believe me." When they played the recordings in court, the silence was deafening. Julia's voice, cold and calculating, talking about Sophie like she was a problem to be solved rather than a child to be protected. Thomas's voice agreeing, planning, complicit in every cruel detail. Thomas had already pled guilty to conspiracy and insurance fraud in exchange for his testimony against Julia. He sat in the witness box looking like a broken man, answering Walsh's questions in a voice barely above a whisper. "She said Ethan was dangerous," he testified. "She showed me medical records that supposedly proved he'd hurt Sophie before he deployed. She had photographs of bruises, recordings of Sophie crying, and saying she was scared of Daddy coming home. Did you verify any of this evidence? No. I trusted her. She was very convincing. She could make you believe anything. Even that a 5-year-old child was safer without her father? Thomas broke down then, sobbing like a child himself. I thought I was protecting Sophie. I thought I was doing the right thing. But the most damning testimony came from Dr. Elizabeth Crenshaw, the psychiatrist who had prescribed Sophie's medications. Under cross-examination, she admitted that all her information about Sophie's condition had come from Julia. Mrs. Parker was very convincing, Dr. Crenshaw said defensively. She presented as a concerned mother dealing with a traumatized child. She had documentation of behavioral incidents, recordings of night terrors, even physical evidence of self-harm. Did you ever speak to Sophie alone? Mrs. Parker felt that would be too traumatic for the child in her current state. Did you ever speak to Sophie's father? He was deployed. Mrs. Parker said he was having his own psychological difficulties and couldn't be trusted to give accurate information about Sophie's condition. So all your medical decisions about a 5-year-old child were based entirely on information provided by a woman who, as we now know, was systematically abusing that child. Dr. Crenshaw's career was over, and she knew it. I followed standard protocols that failed a child who desperately needed help. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. Guilty on all counts: insurance fraud, child endangerment, conspiracy, filing false reports, and attempted kidnapping. The judge sentenced Julia to 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole only after serving the full 20-5 days. They led her away in shackles. Julia turned to look at Ethan and Sophie one last time. "I hope you're happy," she said. "You've destroyed your daughter's chance at a normal life." Sophie, sitting between Ethan and Dr. Ruiz, looked back at her with remarkable composure. "My life is normal now," she said, "because you're not in it anymore." The baby was born 3 weeks later in the prison medical facility. A healthy girl, with Thomas's dark hair and Julia's blue eyes. Thomas, facing his own prison sentence, signed away his parental rights. The baby was placed with a foster family while the courts decided her fate. Ethan found himself in the strange position of petitioning for custody of his ex-wife's child with another man. Not because he had any legal obligation, but because Sophie asked him to. "She's my sister," Sophie said simply when the family court judge asked her opinion. "She didn't choose to have a bad mommy, and Daddy says family takes care of family." The judge, a grandmother herself, was moved by Sophie's maturity. "And how do you think you'll feel about sharing your daddy with a baby?" "I think I'll like teaching her things. Like how to use the recorder, and how to make pancakes, and how to not be scared when planes fly over, because that just means someone's daddy is coming home." They named the baby Hope. It seemed appropriate. The adjustment wasn't easy. Hope was a fussy baby, colicky and difficult, as if she'd absorbed her mother's anxiety in the womb. Sophie appointed herself as chief helper, singing lullabies and helping with feedings, but there were hard nights when both girls cried, and Ethan wondered if he was in over his head. Dr. Ruiz became a regular part of their lives, helping Sophie process her trauma and helping Ethan learn to parent a child who'd been systematically abused. The nightmares took months to fade. Sophie's hypervigilance took even longer. But slowly, gradually, their house began to feel like a home instead of a crime scene. Sophie started eating foods that weren't white or brown. She stopped asking permission to use the bathroom. She learned to laugh without looking over her shoulder, to see if anyone was angry about the noise. And Ethan learned that coming home from war wasn't just about surviving the battlefield. It was about building something worth surviving for. One evening, when Hope was 6 months old and Sophie was 7, they were sitting in the living room together. Sophie was reading to Hope from a picture book while the baby gurgled and tried to grab the pages. It was an ordinary moment, the kind that might not seem significant to anyone else, but to Ethan, it felt like a miracle. "Daddy," Sophie said without looking up from her book, "do you think Hope will remember being born in jail?" It was the kind of question that would have floored him a year ago, but he'd learned that Sophie's questions deserved honest answers, even when they were difficult. "I don't think so, sweetheart. Babies don't remember being born, and she was only there for a few days before she came to live with us." "Good. I don't want her to have bad dreams like I did." "What about your dreams, Sophie? Are they still bad?" Sophie considered this seriously. "Sometimes. But mostly they're good now. I dream about teaching Hope to ride a bike, and about you reading us stories, and about us being a real family. We are a real family, I know. But in my dreams, we always were. Like the bad stuff never happened." Ethan set down the legal brief he'd been reading. He was taking night classes now, studying to become a paralegal specializing in military family law, and joined his daughters on the floor. "Sophie, the bad stuff did happen. And it's okay to remember it, because remembering it helps us make sure it never happens again. But the good stuff is happening too. Every day, more good stuff." Sophie nodded solemnly. "Like Hope learning to smile. And like you teaching me to change her diaper without getting peed on. Exactly like that." Hope reached up and grabbed a handful of Ethan's hair, babbling something that sounded almost like "Dada." Sophie giggled. "She's trying to say, Daddy, I've been practicing with her." "What else have you been teaching her?" "Important stuff. Like how to tell the difference between good touching and bad touching. And how to scream really loud if someone tries to hurt her. And how to hide a recorder if she needs to save evidence." Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Sophie, you don't need to worry about that anymore. Hope is safe. You're both safe. I know. But just in case. Because bad people look like normal people. Sometimes, and little kids need to know how to protect themselves." It broke his heart that his 7-year-old daughter had to think about such things. But it also made him proud that she'd survived what she'd survived and still wanted to protect others. "You're going to be an amazing big sister," he said. "I already am," Sophie replied matter-of-factly. "Hope told me." "Hope can't talk yet. She talks, just not with words. She tells me things with her eyes and her hands and the way she looks at and me. She says she's glad I'm her sister, and she's not scared because I'm here to keep her safe." Ethan looked down at Hope, who was indeed gazing at Sophie with what looked like adoration. Maybe Sophie was right. Maybe babies did have their own way of communicating trust and love. "What else does she tell you?" "That she likes it when we all sleep in the big bed together during thunderstorms. And that she thinks your pancakes taste better than the ones from the box. And that she knows her first mommy wasn't very good at being a mommy, but she's not sad about it because she has us." Now, Ethan had to blink back tears. "She told you all that?" "Babies are very wise," Sophie said seriously. "They haven't learned to lie yet." That night, after both girls were asleep, Ethan sat in his study working on an essay for his paralegal program. The assignment was to write about a case that had affected him personally and analyze how the legal system had succeeded or failed the victims involved. He'd chosen to write about Julia's other victims, the military family she'd destroyed, before she'd targeted his own. The investigation had uncovered a pattern that went back 5 years and crossed 3 states. 4 dead husbands, 6 traumatized children, nearly $1 million in fraudulent insurance claims. The system had failed those families in systematic ways. Child protective services that were understaffed and overworked. Military bureaucracy that was slow to recognize mental health red flags. Insurance companies that were too eager to pay out claims to sympathetic widows. And a society that was so grateful to military families that it rarely questioned their stories of tragedy and trauma. But the system had also, eventually, worked. Julia was in prison. Thomas was facing his own consequences. The other children, the ones who'd survived their father's tragic accidents, were being reunited with relatives or placed in better homes. Dr. Crenshaw had lost her license, and new protocols were being put in place to prevent similar cases. Ethan's phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Is this Ethan Parker?" The voice was female, young, nervous. "Yes. My name is Amanda Chun. I was married to Staff Sergeant Michael Chun. He died in a car accident 2 years ago." Ethan felt his blood chill. "I'm sorry for your loss. I saw the news about your wife, about what she did. And I'm Mr. Parker. I think she might have killed my husband too." They talked for an hour. Amanda's story was heartbreakingly familiar. A husband deployed overseas, a wife struggling with a difficult child, a tragic accident that left a young widow with a substantial insurance payout. The child, Michael's son from his first marriage, had been placed with his biological mother after Michael's death, but not before showing signs of severe trauma and abuse. "The thing is," Amanda said, "I never met Julia Parker. But I did meet Sarah Mitchell at a support group for military wives. She was so helpful, so understanding. She gave me advice about handling my stepson's behavioral problems, even recommended a psychiatrist who could prescribe medication if things got too difficult." "Dr. Elizabeth Crenshaw? How did you know?" Ethan closed his eyes. Lucky guess. By the time he hung up, Ethan had 3 more names to give to the FBI task force that was investigating Julia's crimes. 3 more families that had been destroyed by a woman who'd turned sympathy into a weapon and used the system's own compassion against the people it was meant to protect. He looked at his essay, at the neat paragraphs analyzing legal failures and systematic reforms. But the real story wasn't in the legal analysis. The real story was in the voices of the survivors, the children who'd been brave enough to speak up, the relatives who'd asked the right questions, the professionals who'd finally listened. The real story was Sophie, sleeping peacefully in the next room with her baby sister. A 7-year-old girl who'd survived hell and come out the other side, determined to protect others from the same fate. 2 years later, Sophie testified before a congressional subcommittee on military family services. At 9 years old, she was the youngest person ever to address Congress about child protection issues. Ethan sat in the gallery, watching his daughter speak with the same quiet authority she'd shown in the courtroom. "My name is Sophie Parker," she said into the microphone that had been lowered to accommodate her height. "When I was 5 years old, my mommy tried to kill me. Not all at once, but slowly, with medicine that made me sick and punishments that hurt my body and lies that hurt my heart." The room was silent except for the clicking of cameras and the scratch of reporters' pens. "But I'm not here to talk about my mommy. I'm here to talk about the people who were supposed to protect me, but didn't. The doctor who gave me medicine without talking to me. The social worker who believed my mommy's lies instead of looking at my bruises. The system that was so worried about my daddy being a dangerous soldier that nobody noticed my mommy was the real danger." She paused, looking out at the assembled congressmen and women with remarkable composure. "I survived because I was brave, and because my daddy taught me to be smart, and because I had a recorder that saved the truth. But other kids might not be so lucky. Other kids might not have a daddy who comes home. Other kids might not know how to save evidence or speak up for themselves." Sophie pulled out her pink recorder, the same one she'd used to capture Julia's confessions 3 years earlier. "This is what saved me. A $20 recorder from the electronics store. But what if every kid had one? What if every child welfare worker listened to kids the same way they listen to adults? What if doctors had to talk to kids alone before they prescribed medicine? What if we taught children that they have the right to be safe, and the right to be believed, and the right to speak up when adults are hurting them?" When Sophie finished her testimony, The subcommittee chairwoman had tears in her eyes. "Sophie, you're very brave. Do you have any other recommendations for how we can better protect military children?" Sophie thought for a moment. "Yes, ma'am. I think every military family should have someone checking on them who isn't part of the family. Someone whose job is just to make sure the kids are okay. Because sometimes daddies are deployed and mommies are stressed and bad things happen when nobody's watching." That's a very wise suggestion. And I think kids should learn about body safety and emotional safety in school, just like they learn about fire safety and stranger danger. Because the most dangerous people aren't strangers. They're the people who are supposed to love you. The Sophie Parker Act passed 6 months later. It mandated regular welfare checks for military children when a parent was deployed, required child protection workers to interview children separately from their parents, and established funding for school programs that taught children about abuse recognition and reporting. But for Sophie, the real victory was smaller and more personal. Hope's first word wasn't mama or dada. It was Sophie, clear as a bell, spoken while reaching chubby arms toward her big sister. "She knows who keeps her safe," Sophie told Ethan proudly. "She knows who's going to teach her everything she needs to know." Ethan watched his daughters together, Hope toddling around the living room while Sophie patiently showed her how to stack blocks and marveled at how life could turn out. 3 years ago, he'd come home from war expecting to find a wife and daughter. Instead, he'd found betrayal, trauma, and a mystery that had nearly destroyed what was left of his family. But he'd also found something else. His daughter's incredible strength, her determination to survive and thrive and protect others. Sophie had saved herself with courage and cleverness, and in doing so, she'd saved him too. Now they were a family of 3, bound not by blood or law but by choice. Sophie had chosen to trust him when every adult in her life had failed her. Ethan had chosen to fight for her when the system would have let her fall through the cracks. And Hope? Hope had chosen them simply by being born into their world and accepting their love. On quiet evenings like this one, when both girls were safe and happy and the house was filled with the ordinary sounds of family life, Ethan sometimes thought about Julia. She was serving her sentence in a maximum security facility 3 states away, and according to her lawyer, she spent most of her time in the prison library, reading legal texts and filing appeals. She maintained her innocence, claimed she'd been a victim of postpartum depression and military spouse syndrome. She painted herself as a woman driven to desperate measures by an uncaring system and a dangerous husband. Her appeals were consistently denied, but she kept filing them, kept insisting that she'd been trying to protect her children from a father damaged by war. Ethan had tried to hate her. It seemed like the natural response to someone who'd tortured his daughter and nearly destroyed their family. But hatred required a kind of energy he didn't want to spend on her anymore. Instead, he felt something closer to pity. Julia had thrown away everything good in her life. A husband who loved her, a daughter who would have adored her, a chance at happiness, for money and the thrill of manipulation. She'd chosen to see Sophie as an obstacle instead of a gift. She'd chosen to see Ethan's deployment as abandonment instead of service. She'd chosen to see their marriage as a prison instead of a partnership. And those choices had led her to a real prison, where she'd spend the rest of her productive years, paying for the family she'd destroyed. Sophie never asked about Julia anymore. Occasionally, someone at school would bring up the news stories or the congressional testimony, but Sophie handled those questions with the same matter-of-fact composure she brought to everything else. "My birth mother made bad choices," she would say. "Now she lives in jail and I live with my daddy and Hope. We're all much happier this way." And they were. Ethan's nightmares had faded along with Sophie's. His hands no longer shook when he heard unexpected sounds. He'd learned to sleep through the night without checking the locks 3 times. He'd learned to trust that the people he loved would still be there in the morning. Hope was walking now. chattering in a mixture of English and toddler gibberish that Sophie seemed to understand perfectly. She had Thomas's dark hair but none of his weakness, Julia's blue eyes but none of her cruelty. She was curious and fearless and completely secure in the knowledge that she was loved and protected. "Daddy," Sophie said as she helped Hope navigate the stairs one evening, "I've been thinking about when Hope gets older." "What about it? Do you think she'll want to know about her birth parents?" It was a question Ethan had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. Sophie's emotional intelligence continued to amaze him, her ability to think through complex issues that many adults avoided. "I think that's something we'll figure out when she's old enough to ask," he said. "What do you think we should tell her?" "The truth, but the gentle truth, not the scary truth. Like, her first mommy wasn't very good at being a mommy, so we became her family instead. And her birth daddy made some bad mistakes, but he's sorry about them now. And that none of it was her fault and all of it led her to us. That sounds perfect. And maybe we should tell her about the good parts too. Like how she has your eyes when she's concentrating on something, and how she laughs exactly like you do when something really surprises her. And how she's brave like me but gentle in a way I'm still learning to be." Ethan pulled Sophie into a hug. "When did you get so wise?" "I've always been wise. I just had to get brave enough to show it." As they tucked Hope into her crib that night, she looked up at them with those bright blue eyes and said, "Night-night, Daddy. Night-night, Sophie." Clear words, perfectly pronounced, spoken with complete trust and love. "Night-night, baby girl." Sophie whispered back, "Sweet dreams." And as Ethan turned off the light and closed the door, he thought about how perfect that phrase was. Sweet dreams for a little girl who would never know the nightmare her biological parents had created. Sweet dreams for Sophie, who had survived her own nightmare and come out stronger. Sweet dreams for himself, a soldier who had finally found the peace he'd been fighting for all along. Some stories, he thought, don't end with victory parades or medals of honor. They end with ordinary moments that feel extraordinary because they almost didn't happen at all. They end with children who feel safe enough to sleep peacefully, with families built not from convenience or convention, but from choice and commitment and love. They end with the understanding that the most important battles aren't always fought on foreign soil. Sometimes they're fought in courtrooms and living rooms and the quiet spaces of the human heart. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply making it home, not just to a place, but to the people who make that place worth defending. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, you get to raise the next generation to be braver and wiser and kinder than the one that came before. Sometimes you get to watch your children grow up free from the fears that shaped your own childhood, secure in the knowledge that they are loved and protected and believed. That's the real victory. That's the war worth winning. That's the story worth telling, even when it's hard, even when it hurts, even when the ending is still being written one ordinary day at a time. Because in the end, we all choose what kind of story we want to tell with our lives. And Ethan Parker, Staff Sergeant, United States Army, retired, father of 2 beautiful daughters, chose love. Every day, in every small decision, in every moment of patience and protection and promise, he chose love. And that, as his wise daughter Sophie would say, made all the difference.